the life of Joseph, you can't help but think as a human being, one of the thoughts that pops into your mind is, was it worth it all? You know, you read about how Joseph ascends to this great position of power and prestige, but he had to go through a lot to get there. And, you know, it covered a lot of time, almost 22 years that we read about where he had some of the lowest of lows in life. And when you look at it, God is always using those bad experiences, even in the life of Joseph, to bring about good things to him and for him. But what is often overlooked is not only did what God do to Joseph bring good things to him, it also brought good things to his family. And a lot of those things that it brought to that family were made possible because of the forgiveness of Joseph. If Joseph had not been a forgiving individual, there's a lot of good things that his family would not have experienced. And so I think that's important to us because, as I mentioned this morning, that family of Israel, which were God's chosen people, is a model and an example for us today. And so I want us to think about the importance of forgiveness tonight and some of the things that were made possible for Jacob's family and Joseph's family because of his forgiving spirit. Now, sometimes as a preacher, when you're putting lessons together, you have all these creative ideas and, you have these great titles, but I couldn't come up with one. And so tonight it's entitled Some Thoughts on Forgiveness. And that's basically what it is, but based upon this story, the latter part of it, that's found in Genesis chapter 45. The first thing that I want us to think about is that being able to forgive other people speaks volumes to the world. And you see that in the life of Joseph and those who were living around him. If you look at verse 16 in Genesis 45, it says, "And the fame thereof was heard in Pharaoh's house, saying, Joseph's brethren are come, and it pleased Pharaoh well and his servants. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, Say unto thy brethren, This do ye, lade your beast, and go get you to the land of Canaan. And take your father and your households, and come unto me, and I will give you the good of the land of Egypt, and ye shall eat of the fat of the land. Now thou art commanded, this do, take you the wagons out of the land of Egypt for your little ones and for your wives, and bring your father, and come. Also regard not your stuff, for the good of all the land of Egypt is yours." Think about the example that Joseph sets even for us within the church today. You think about a person, and when you look through the Bible and you think about, what kind of characters in the Bible exemplify forgiveness? Joseph is one of those names that jumps to the top of the list. And because Joseph was such a forgiving person, those who lived around him experienced a lot of blessings from that. I know I made mention of the fact this morning that as far as the biblical record is concerned, Joseph never really told anybody around him about what his brothers did to him, and I think what he forgave them of. Now, some might say, there's kind of some language that indicates his father may have known, and that may be the case. I'm just saying there's no black and white statement in the Bible where you'll read about him doing that. But even though he didn't tell them, God chose to record it in the history for all of mankind to read about and to think about over the ages, and even people within the world. The story of Joseph and the coat of many colors, they're familiar with that story, and they're familiar with the idea of Joseph being a very forgiving person. You think about this story, if it were written from a worldly perspective, and if Joseph had interacted with his brothers from a worldly view, how differently this story could have turned out. Joseph being in the position that he was in, it would have been the perfect time for him to have sought revenge on his brothers. It would have been the perfect time to have shown them who was boss and to give them what they deserved from the standpoint of the world. But because Joseph was a forgiving person, he reacted differently. And because he reacted differently, that speaks volumes to the world today and even to the church today as to the kind of individuals that we should be and the blessings that came upon other people and do come upon other people from us being a merciful and a forgiving people. If this story were not in the Bible, the world would not get to see one of the finest stories and experience one of the blessings of the finest stories on forgiveness. You remember what Paul wrote in Galatians 5 and verse 15? We're talking about the idea of being forgiven and how that can speak to the world in which we live today. But as he wrote to the church there, he said, "But if ye bite and devour one another, take heed that ye be not consumed of one another." You know, the Bible teaches us that separation and division and strife is harmful in a lot of ways. It's harmful to us as an individual, but if we're constantly striving with people and we're fighting with people and we're divisive, it not only brings harm to us as individuals personally, but it also brings harm to the Lord's church. And the world, as they look at us, they're looking at what kind of people are we? What kind of character do we possess? Are we forgiving and merciful people? Or are we people who carry a grudge and people who are constantly fighting and being divided with people, not only within the church itself, but also within the world? Paul was talking about in this verse, interesting, the idea of Christian liberty and particularly the idea of freedom. And basically he's writing here about how as Christians we can never really be free if we're slaves to strife, if we're slaves to division. And so the answer to being free from division and strife is forgiveness or mercy. And certainly you see that exemplified in the life of Joseph. Joseph, as you look at those Egyptians, they were all happy, they were all rejoicing, they were sharing in a great time. And the reason is because Joseph was a merciful or a forgiving person. If he had been a person who held a grudge, you wouldn't have read about that same celebration. You wouldn't have read about the Egyptians being happy with Joseph and enjoying all these different things. So being able to forgive speaks volumes. It tells the world about the character that we possess as followers of God today. The second thing that I want to talk about tonight, and again taken from these verses, and this might be a point that husbands know well, but gifts can help when seeking forgiveness. And you see that in the life of Joseph here. If you look at verse 21 in Genesis 45, it said, "The children of Israel did so, and Joseph gave them wagons according to the commandment of Pharaoh, and gave them provisions for the way. To all of them he gave gave each man changes of raiment, but to Benjamin he gave 300 pieces of silver and 5 changes of raiment. And to his father he sent after this manner, 10 donkeys laden with the good things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys laden with corn and bread and meat for his father by the way." We talked about the idea this morning how Joseph showed concern for those he was trying to forgive. You know, he was not only willing to put the past behind him, but he also wanted to help those people, his brothers, in any way that he could, because he really did love them. He really cared about them. He was concerned for their well-being. And so you see this care and this concern manifested in the wagons, first of all, that he sends back. He sends back not only these wagons, he also sends back all the necessary provisions that his entire family would need in order to make that journey down into Egypt. And then not only did he give him what we might deem the necessities, but he also gave them some special gifts. To each one of his brothers, he gave a new change of clothes. And, I can kind of remember when I was a kid and at Christmas time when you would open gifts, one of the things that I did not want to get was clothes, because I just felt like that was a cheap present. You knew you were going to get clothes anyway, but you didn't want that to be your Christmas present. But back then, that was a good gift. That was something that people really appreciated. You didn't get that every day. And so to get a new change of clothes, that was a very special gift that Joseph gave to his brothers. Of course, to Benjamin was his own flesh and blood. The other brothers were stepbrothers, remember. Benjamin was his only true brother. And so to him, he gives him 300 pieces of silver and gives him 5 sets of clothing. To his father, he gives him 10 male and 10 female donkeys. The male donkeys are laden down with all the best things that Egypt has to offer. The female donkeys are laden with the food that would have been necessary, the corn and the bread, the things that would have been necessary to make that journey down into Egypt. But the question becomes, why did Joseph do this? And the answer is because he had forgiven his brethren. And so again, he didn't have any grudges toward them. He didn't have any hard feelings toward them. All he wanted to do was help. And all he wanted to do was strengthen that relationship that existed between those two. The idea of giving gifts in order to seek forgiveness, that was a tactic, of course, that his father, Joseph's father, Jacob, employed earlier on in his life. You remember the story back in Genesis chapter 32, as Jacob is coming back from staying with Laban, his uncle, that he hears about Esau, his brother, coming toward him. And remember that Jacob and Esau had a huge fight. Esau had basically threatened to kill Jacob. That's why he left and why he sought safety under his uncle's roof. And so there's some way Jacob wanted to mend that relationship. And so how does he go about doing that? Well, we read in Genesis 32 and verse 13, he took of that which came to his hand a present for Esau his brother. 200 female goats and 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 kine and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys, and 10 foals. Now, Jacob used that tactic, giving a gift. You remember, he sends those things before him, and he comes at the end of all these gifts. But to try to help to begin forming that relationship, mending that relationship back with his brother Esau. And so what we learn from that is gifts can help when trying to seek forgiveness from another person. What's interesting about Joseph's story is, understand that Joseph was the one who did the forgiving. It wasn't his brothers that brought him gifts because they were the ones who had done him wrong, like in Jacob's case. And Joseph, he had already forgiven them. And so you have this idea, even though he had already forgiven them, he's still giving them these gifts. And so that lays down that principle that gifts can not only help when we're seeking forgiveness, beginning in the process itself, the first step, but also if you're trying to strengthen a relationship that's based on forgiveness, which is what Joseph was doing, those gifts can help put forth that idea or that principle of forgiveness. The third thing that I want to talk about tonight, again based upon Genesis 45, is avoid blaming others, or try not to blame other people when you're looking to accomplish forgiveness. And it's interesting, if you look in verse 24, what Joseph says to his brothers. It says, "So he sent his brethren away, and they departed, and he said unto them, See that ye fall not out by the way." Do you understand what Joseph is telling his brothers here? He says, now here you go, you're going back. Remember, this is a very long journey. Could have taken them a number of weeks in order to accomplish this journey. And Joseph's advice to his brothers was, don't get into an argument. Well, what would they argue about? If you remember some of the times as they're standing before Joseph, they're standing there and they're arguing about who was to blame when it came to what happened to Joseph. One guy said, well, I told you not to do this. And the other guy said, well, we didn't want to kill him, so we were going to sell him. And so there was a lot of bickering between the different brothers, I guess you could say, as to who was to blame the most in what happened to Joseph. And so Joseph says, as you're going along the way here, don't have a falling out. See that you don't argue about what has happened. And it's just human nature, for us to want to be able to point the finger at one person and say, well, this is the person that should receive the most blame. This is the person who is the most guilty. This is the person who is the most responsible. And if we can, even though we might know that we might be guilty ourselves, but if we can kind of minimize our participation, if we can point the finger at somebody else and say, well, yeah, you can blame me, but you can blame them even more, it kind of makes us feel better as individuals. And so that's something that Joseph was genuinely concerned about would happen between his brothers. That's a tactic, again, that mankind has employed from the first sin. All of us are familiar with Adam and Eve in the beginning. Whenever they sinned and ate of the forbidden fruit, that God appears to Adam. And of course, God asked Adam, why did he know that he was naked? Did he eat of that fruit that he had been forbidden to eat of? And remember Adam's reply in verse 12. He said, "The woman whom thou gavest to be with me, she gave me of the tree, and I did eat." Now, why did Adam say that? It's obvious, number one, that Adam was guilty, right? And if you stop and you really parse out what he said was indeed true. The woman did give him of the fruit, and Adam ate it because Eve did give it to him. But why would he turn the blame toward Eve? He himself was the one who ate of it. That didn't change anything. You know, it didn't minimize his guilt. But if you can kind of deflect the guilt, or you can kind of point your finger over here and say, well, I know I did that and I probably shouldn't have done it, but here's the reason why I did it. You know, here's the most guilty person. Here's the person you should really blame when it comes to this shortcoming or this sin. It makes us as humans feel a little bit better. And of course, Eve did exactly the same thing, right? When God comes to Eve, he says, you know, did you Eve the fruit? And she said, well, the serpent beguiled me, and he did eat. Well, was that true? Yeah, it was true. I mean, Satan lied to her, he deceived her, he got her to believe that lie, and that's why she ate of that fruit. But again, it didn't change the fact that she was at fault in the matter. It didn't change the fact that Adam was at fault in the matter. And so it didn't absolve any of their responsibility for what they had done. The story of Aaron and the golden calf, Exodus chapter 32, is another good example of that idea. Remember, as Moses comes down from the mount, he sees this golden calf. He put Aaron in charge. He was the one who was responsible for all the people. He sees the people worshiping this calf, and he's mad at Aaron. And remember what Aaron says in verse 22. He says, "Let not the anger of my Lord wax hot. Thou knowest the people, that they are set on mischief." Well, stop and think about that statement. Is that true? Absolutely. I mean, when you look at the children of Israel, Moses talks about them being rebellious from the time that God brought them up out of the land of Egypt. Now, Aaron says some other things that aren't true, but that was one true thing that he did say. But why did he say it? To deflect some of the guilt, right? To deflect some of the blame, to point the finger and say, yeah, you know, I shouldn't have done what I did, but if you want to know who's most guilty, if you want to know who you really should blame in all this, that's the people right there. They're the ones who are responsible for it. And so that's what Joseph didn't want to happen along the way. He didn't want people pointing fingers at each other and trying to pass the blame and say, well, this is the guy that we should really hold accountable for everything that had happened. I often tell my children, it takes two people to fight, and there's a lot of truth in that. You know, it takes two people to be reconciled too. If you don't have two willing parties, no reconciliation will take place. But usually in a fight, there's blame to pass to both individuals, to everybody who's involved. Now, some may be more involved than others, but again, it doesn't absolve a person of their guilt or their participation in what is going on. And so the bottom line was each individual was involved in what happened to Joseph in some way. And there was no reason to argue about who was the most guilty or the most responsible or who was to blame the most. And so think about that from the standpoint of, again, reconciliation and forgiveness. If we've got a problem with somebody else, you know, we come together and we start arguing, well, who should we blame the most about this problem that we have between us? What's that going to accomplish? The reality of the situation is there's probably a little bit of blame to pass around to everybody. And if we're trying to accomplish forgiveness, which is what Joseph was wanting to accomplish with his brothers, it doesn't matter who's the most guilty, who we should blame the most, who's the most responsible. Everybody had taken part in it. And so don't pass the buck off to somebody else. The last thing that I want to talk about tonight are some benefits that come from forgiveness. And you see that beginning in verse 25. It says, "They went up out of Egypt and came into the land of Canaan unto Jacob their father, and told him, saying, Joseph is yet alive, and he is governor over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's heart fainted, for he believed them not. And they told him all the words of Joseph, which he had said unto them. And when he saw the wagons which Joseph had sent to carry him, the spirit of Jacob their father revived. And Israel said, It is enough. Joseph my son is yet alive. I will go and see him before I die." Two results that I want us to think about, two benefits that came from Joseph forgiving his brothers. The first one is the heart of their father was revived. And that's an interesting statement. You read back in verse 26, when he first hears that Joseph is alive, the Bible says his heart faints, or literally we might say his heart skipped a beat. You know, it surprised him so much that he could hardly believe what had been said. But the benefit there in verse 27 is he had a renewed spirit. You know, Jacob was alive once again. He came back to life. And so he had a breath of fresh air, we might say. He got a second wind. And some commentators read about that and they say, well, you know, that's talking about Jacob reviving because he knew he wasn't going to lose everything. And that would have been something that would have been difficult to think about. You know, he was worried about losing his sons. Undoubtedly, he was worried about losing his animals and losing his farm and his wealth because of the famine that exists in those days. But if you notice back in verse 27, the reason that his heart faints and the reason that his spirit is revived is because he learns that his Joseph is alive. That's what gave him renewed strength. It wasn't just this idea of not losing everything now, but this son that he thought was dead for over 22 years, he now learns is really alive. And one of the most hurtful things that we experience probably as parents is to see our children fighting among one another. You know, it's a lot more pleasant to see our children loving each other and caring for each other and standing up for one another. And that's no different when it comes to the perspective of God. One of the things that tugs at the heartstrings of God is when he sees his children fighting amongst one another. Do you know what can revive the Spirit of God? It's when his children are reunited. It's when they practice forgiveness and mercy. And so most parents would pay any price to have their children getting along. And God is no different than that. The second benefit, though, that I see in this act of forgiveness is the family is reunited once again. You know, they had been divided. All of them, there were barriers that had been built in that family between parents and children and brothers. But once again, they're all united. And what's interesting to me as you read those verses that we looked at, notice the change in name in verse 27 and verse 28. It talks about in verse 27 that the spirit of Jacob, their father, revived. And then in verse 28 it says, and Israel said. That's interesting to me that in one verse he's called Jacob, and then the very next verse he's named Israel. Now remember why Jacob got that name. That was a very special name that was given to him by God. But it represents this idea that the family was back together again. Israel was now whole once again. He thought part of Israel was missing whenever he believed that Joseph was dead. But now his family is ready. Now they're reunited. Now they're ready to be a great nation. Now they're ready to inherit the promised land. Now they're ready to bear the promised seed. This family is a model of what God's family wants his children to be today. He wanted these people to be leaders. He wanted them to be blessings. He wanted them to be light to others around them. Were they perfect individuals? No, they weren't. But you know what they were? They were merciful and they were forgiving. And so the sovereign God is now bringing the Jews into the land of Egypt. First, they're going to enter into Egypt as honored guests. Eventually, they're going to end up as suffering slaves. But through this whole process, God is molding these people into the nation that he needed them to be in order to accomplish what he wanted them to do. And you know, all of these things that happen are made possible because of forgiveness. Think about how important forgiveness is for us as God's children today. Maybe there's one here tonight who's not yet a child of God. The invitation